Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Surf's PIP Network. I'm Ewan Leach. If you haven't met me before, I'm the Chief Executive of Surf, and the purpose of this network is to look at how policy works actually in place. So I think you're all probably in sunny places this morning, and if you've chosen to come along to this morning's network meeting and not go out and enjoy the sun, then thank you very much for joining us. And the topic that we're looking at today is around one specific place, and it's Dunfermline. And as you may be aware, Dunfermline had a citizens' assembly that ran earlier this year. But obviously, the assembly which ran this year was the result of quite a long kind of run-in process. And as Surf are interested in communities having control and agency of what happens around them, we thought the Citizens Assembly was a particularly good thing for us to be looking at now as we are running into up to the Holyrood election, but looking at what sort of form local people have in kind of controlling their neighbourhood or having involvement in the decision making that's happening in their neighbourhood. And so we've got about 5 guests this morning speaking from various aspects of the Citizens Assembly process and outcome and recommendations. But I think for a number of us, the process around the Citizens Assembly is of sort of high interest. And so for this morning, I think you've already been sent the agenda, but this morning we're going to hear from Jonathan Shaffey from the Electoral Reform Society Scotland, and then we're going to hear from a Citizens Assembly member, Temi, who is a local resident and business owner within Dunfermline. We thought it was important to hear quite early on in the discussion what actually a participant's experience was. And then we will follow that up with hearing from Lisa, John, and Craig, who were all involved in the kind of process from a local authority perspective view, from a community perspective, and Two Community Garden. Some of you may have remember Lisa speaking to us before about the work that Two Community Garden have been doing. And John Storm, who was one of the facilitators who within the actual assembly, who is also a Dunfermline resident. So we thought this morning we've got one presentation from Jonathan around the background and why citizens' assemblies are, we think, of value. But the rest of it will kind of be primarily conversational, hearing more from the people who participated in the assembly and the kind of running of it. And obviously, we'll have opportunity for Q&A, but if you have questions that pop up during the presentations or during the discussion, feel free to put them in the chat or put your hand up, and it would be nice to see other faces and hear other voices as well, so feel free to put your hand up as well. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Jonathan from the Electoral Reform Society Scotland, and Jonathan has a presentation. Jonathan, do you want to unmute and share your presentation? That's great, I can see it.
Okay, folks, that's everyone see that okay and hear me okay? Excellent.
Yep, can hear you as well.
First of all, just want to thank Ewan and Surf for organising this and for inviting us to come along and make this presentation. Because what happened in Dunfermline with this process, I think was very inspiring. But we also want to take this example and see what we can do in terms of generalising some of the best practice right across the country. Because as I'll kind of come on to kind of talk about, our view of citizens' assemblies from an ERS perspective is that we think that there's a crisis of democracy. There is a real feeling of alienation between people and institutions. There is a sense in which people feel things are going in the wrong direction. And our answer to that is not to have less democracy, but is to have more. So obviously, we are passionate about elections. We are passionate about making elections as fair and proportional as possible. But we also think that there are a range of innovations that go beyond elections and between elections, which allow more power to lie with people and which allow for decision making to be decentralized and devolved. And one of the key areas that we're interested in is local democracy. And as part of that, we're interested in how citizens' assemblies could play a role at a local level as well as a national level. But in this instance, at a local level, in terms of bringing people together and allowing people based in that community to come up with ideas for how it can be taken forward. And it's essentially based on a very simple concept that we feel that, and this is a popular message, by the way, that communities have got so much to offer. They've got so much knowledge and expertise, and they've also, and this is something that just came up time and again during the assembly, and we'll talk about it with the other speakers as well today, that people are genuinely passionate about their area, but just sometimes don't feel they have the opportunity or the platform to translate that into something really tangible. And that's where the Citizens Assembly comes in. So we set some kind of intentions for this process, which we thought were useful and were sort of as a guide or a framework for how we wanted to go about this process. That we wanted the assembly to be seen as a real investment, not a tick box exercise, not something which is a an extractive kind of process where people feel that they've kind of been churned through the assembly. We want this to have something which really leaves a legacy, both in terms of the outcomes, but also in terms of the experience of those involved. Because ideally, we want this to be the first of many citizens' assemblies, as I say, across the country. We also wanted to adopt the idea that we want to have as many kind of experts, as many kind of people with background knowledge on different areas that people might find interesting or important, and that they would be involved in a kind of show not tell way, and that we want to create a new layer of active citizens. So a lot of the research and learning that has gone on around citizens' assemblies internationally is that when people go through the process, they often come out the other end feeling revitalised in terms of what they want to offer. Many go on to stand as local councillors or get involved in a local community organisation, or they become advocates more generally for the Citizens' Assembly process. And lastly, that we want to use this as a pilot, as I've kind of referenced, so that we can start to institutionalize this idea in a much more thoroughgoing way, which links local communities with councils and in the end with national government. So this has been a long process. And I think what's really important to stress here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just want to stress a few really important things. This was not a kind of pop-up event. This is something that we took a very long time to engage with people who live in Dunfermline, the general public, local community organisations, that we did this in a multiple formats. So the picture you can see here is of a dream catcher where people put up their kind of hopes and ambitions for the future of Dunfermline. That was at the Children's Gala, which is one of the main kind of events in Dunfermline, where lots of people were in attendance. We had a big outreach campaign in terms of the local press, in terms of social media, and we also conducted many kind of in-person events as well. We also constructed a declaration about the Citizens' Assembly based on workshops, again with a range of community organisations. So everything that went into this process really did come from a process of outreach and engagement in itself. And we think that was really important in terms of the outcomes and the atmosphere at the Assembly. We arrived at this question for the Assembly, which is, we all want Dunfermline to be a great place to call home. As our city grows and develops, how do we continue to improve our community for today and tomorrow? So again, this was part of a process of deliberation, discussion, and debate about how could we encapsulate a question that was both broad enough to include lots of different ideas and not to be too narrow in terms of its scope, but also specific enough that it focused the discussions that we could come to some clear recommendations. The makeup of the assembly, now this is, I can send this round to people as well, but essentially what we did was we sent out thousands of letters to residents right across the city. And through a process known as sortition, we worked with the Sortition Foundation, who are very experienced about this in these processes. We came up with what we feel was a really balanced and representative cross section of the public in Dunfermline. Sometimes these are known as mini publics, so it's a kind of mini version of the public as a whole. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but you can kind of see that we balanced for age, for gender, for voting preferences, that there was a real mix of opinion in the room, a mix of experience. We went through issues around education, disability, and geography. So this was a really quite meticulous process that we went through in order to ensure that we came up with a really great group of people who were very diverse and representative. The sessions themselves were very well facilitated, but we put a lot of effort into the design process, so it met over 3 weekends. The topics arrived at were community led, that was important as well. And this investigated in detail, as I've referenced earlier, lots of expert opinion in the room as well that we recruited and brought in as people who could deliver mini lectures almost on various topics that the community found interesting. And these were very well received, I have to say. And lastly, the whole point in this exercise was that instead of coming to snap decisions, you have a broader discussion over a longer period of time. This picture here, by the way, I should explain, is not from the assembly. It's from an event that was held many years ago called Democracy Max. But the reason we include it is to say that this has been a kind of strand in our thinking, not over just the last year or couple of years, but really over the last 10 years or so. These are the kinds of events that we've been putting on and thinking about, and it kind of crystallised around the Citizens' Assembly. So there are three kind of phases. The learning phase, where members hear balanced evidence from experts, from stakeholders, and other advocates. Then there's a phase of deliberation in which participants discuss the various trade-offs involved. These are facilitated in small groups. And then there's a decision-making phase as well. And the idea here is that members reach a consensus or vote on recommendations that form the final kind of report. This is the summary report that's been produced and contains all of the recommendations, so people can have a look at that as well. And you can find the summary report online. We've also produced a lot of paper copies, which we're using for continued outreach in Dunfermline, which Craig and others will talk more about. I'm just going to skip ahead here just to talk about what the pilot showed and just kind of conclude. Um, we feel that, I mean, it's interesting because by the end of this process, you could see in the room that people who had entered with often quite different perspectives on Dunfermline, perspectives on politics, in fact, on life in general. These are a really diverse group of people, as I've tried to reinforce. That at the end of this process, there was a real sense in which people, even if they didn't agree with each other on every question, had high levels of respect for one another, had high levels of willingness to engage in a structured discussion about the future of Dunfermline. And right from the start, and I found this particularly interesting, that there was a recognition that while there were problems, there was lots to be proud of about Dunfermline. And people felt this across the board. And for me, I just end on this for this reason that, circling back to the start and some of the problems that we feel exist in our democracy and our society, having to do with polarization, feelings of alienation from institutions, feelings of not being heard, a lack of trust in political structures, all of these kind of big topics. In a small way, but in a very important way, I think the Citizens' Assembly model shows that lots of these issues can start to be overcome. They can start to generate a process of real discussion and deliberation, of breaking down barriers, of allowing people to come to a space where they can start to understand and listen to other views, as well as being assured that their views will also count. And that's such an important principle moving forward. So yeah, just in conclusion, this whole process has been years in the making. It's not a tick box exercise. We want this to have a legacy. We are passionate about the potential this could have should it be rolled out and institutionalised across Scotland, not just for improving local areas, towns, cities, and communities, but for improving the overall quality of our democracy and the overall durability and sustainability, and in fact, happiness essentially of our society at large. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that's provided a kind of overview of some of the key issues involved, and we can get into more detail through other speakers and any questions that people may have.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That's really interesting background to it. Can I ask two questions before we kind of move on? One was how many people were involved in the assembly? How many participants in the assembly were there?
Yeah, good question. So initially there was 35. You're always going to have a bit of a dropout. So there were a few dropouts. But here's the interesting thing. Every single person who attended on the first day attended on the last day, and that was 31 people. So instead of having to think about, okay, there's 3 or 4 people that have dropped out for the second weekend or whatever else, that didn't happen. And I think that was just a real kind of, it just showed how useful this process can be. It takes a lot of thought, right, to get people in a room and make them feel valued, make them feel that this is something exciting they want to be part of, and for there not to be that dropout. I should also mention, and others will get into, as I say, more of the detail about the process, that the participants were remunerated. We felt that this was important because we didn't want there to be any barriers to people coming along. We wanted to ensure that there was the platform really for people to feel that they could give up their time to come along and be involved in this process. So we went with that as well. There's ways that you can tweak this process, of course. It's not necessarily one size fits all, but overall, there's some areas we would look to improve. Overall, given the scale of what we're attempting to do, and the depth of what we're trying to achieve, I think we did pretty well in those terms.
Okay. And the other question I had for you was, um, you said the topics were arrived at were led by the community, and was that in the 2 year run up that those topics were kind of identified so that because I'm imagining you'd have to do it then so that you had experts available on the weekends. So was that part of the process how you chose what the Citizens Assembly was going to examine?
Exactly right. Yeah. So everything from that kind of dream catcher that I showed you, that little prop, all the way through to quite intensive workshops with community organisations that were done on a collective basis, where there was maybe many organisations in the room doing a workshop, learning about Citizens Assembly, and us learning from them what was important, through to individual meetings with community organisations and indeed the participants themselves. So the participants themselves were presented with a range of themes that were drawn from all of that process, that 2 year long process of engagement. And then they were asked to kind of rank what they thought were important to kind of zoom in on. So even the topics that are discussed at the Citizens Assembly are very much led from the community. And that's something that was interesting because that was a very shared objective across the partners, whether that was ERS or the council. And I know Craig I'll have lots more to say on that process. But it was something that we were all very collectively passionate about, that we wanted this to really feel that it came from the community. In the end, that's what gives it the legitimacy, right? That's what makes it powerful. That okay, there's 30 odd folk in the room, but they're representative. They're organised through sortition. It's been as a process of years-long engagement with the wider community, and that engagement, as Craig and others will talk about, is continuing. So it's not finished now that the assembly's finished. We are continuing even in the next month with a whole series of workshops with community organisations about the outcomes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm sure other people may have questions for you, which may come up a bit later. But I think some of the final points you made there, if you think back to the early days of social media, it was like this is the commons, the social media space, and people with different views come together. But it's ultimately proven to be incredibly divisive because it doesn't have the sort of human contact element that bringing people together in a shared space. And that to me is it's crucial that we can continue to have differences of opinion about certain things or about approaches, but having that sort of respect for each other happens really in a shared space. I say this obviously, and we're not in a shared physical space just now, but there is a fundamental difference in terms of human relationships when you're actually uh, spending some time with each other, which is crucial. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Temi, coming on to you. you were obviously one of the participants representing residents of Dunfermline. I don't know if you want to just tell us a wee bit about yourself, what you do in Dunfermline, how long you've lived there, stuff like that.
Okay. My name is Temi Ajayi Salami, and I live in Dunfermline. I've been here. I moved in from Nigeria with my family 5 years ago in February 2021, and I also run a business. I've got a physical store, which is the Afro Caribbean grocery store on the at the city center.
Okay, right. Thanks very much. So, when was the sort of first time you heard about the Citizens Assembly? What was your first kind of hearing about it?
Yeah, the first time I heard about the Citizens Assembly, I think I saw it on Facebook, and then I expressed interest to volunteer. So we had our initial meeting at the I think the Abbeville hub. So that was when we knew they were going to select the assembly members, and of course there'll be the volunteers were still required. So um, fortunately, I got the letter at my store, but I didn't get at my home. But I
Yeah.
got the one, yeah, I got one through the store. So I expressed interest to join the assembly. And I think I was randomly selected. Maybe after one or two people dropped out, I got an email to ask if I was still interested. Of course, as a business owner and a resident of Dunfermline, I took the offer. Yeah.
And were you involved in it? Had you had any involvement in any of the workshops in the run up to it, or was the that Jonathan's referred to the Dreamcatcher at the Gala Day? Had you been aware of it through that as well?
No, no, I wasn't aware of that, but I joined the first weekend.
Hmm.
I joined from the
Okay.
first meeting that we had. Yes.
Okay, so that's good. So I'm just checking. So it is kind of fresh to you that your involvement with the Citizen Assembly is just from that point on. And so the first day of it, what was your kind of how did it feel? And did you know anybody there?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
So on the first weekend, we all, I'll speak for myself, but at least I think most of the assembly members felt the same way through conversations. We felt kind of lost in a way. We
Mhm.
weren't so sure about what the outcome was going to be. And we're just skeptical about it could just be like ticking the box. We and our perspective changed over the next weekend. And going there, the first day I went, the first meeting we had, I didn't know anybody, but it didn't feel so because everyone there, everyone in the room were welcoming. We networked, we shared, we had conversations, and yeah, we had a lot of common interests. So
And I suppose you're all in the same boat at the beginning of unknown, but it's also interesting. The skepticism initially. I suppose if all of us, all of us who run community engagement, but also people that we're all kind of recipients of being invited to involved local community, our cynicism or is it a tick box is often a common one. So that's a very honest kind of appraisal, but it's quite good that that quickly kind of those fears were allayed. And in terms of the topics that the had been agreed kind of in the run up to it, did they feel kind of a natural? These were the natural things that you wanted to kind of discuss as a group.
yeah, so regarding the topics, yes, it was. And I think the most interesting part of it was the fact that we all had at least most of the ideas we came up with, or the topics. Initially, the topics felt, last the first weekend, it felt kind of odd. We were actually questioning the relevance of those topics, to what we were actually there for, which was what actually brought about the skepticism and all of that, to see, are we just going to waste our time? Is it just the normal, regular ticking the box, bringing people together just to, say that, oh, they've done something, you know. So I had a reservation to say, oh, I hope it's not going to be a waste of my time,
Hmm.
because I'm a very busy person. But yeah, it wasn't so. And thank God I was able to complete the 3 weekends, because it was like one of the most amazing um, um, process. that I've experienced. Yeah.
And so what made it so amazing in your experience?
The process, the process was the process was seamless, and then hearing different perspective and how respectful the conversations were. Every single person in that room was seen, was heard, and was listened to. So and we all had one thing in common, like one goal in common. In as much as we had different ideas, it was towards one purpose: to make Dunfermline great. So yeah, that was the thing for me.
And so I mean, I'm interested in the sort of differences of perspective. Were there any points where you heard things, it was difficult to hear certain things that people felt were important about Dunfermline, or there were differences, and and how did the group kind of respond to that when there were sort of points of rub?
Okay, so the way the session was done, we had to write our opinions and suggestions, down, and then as a group, we're able to discuss it and then streamline it to, pointers, relevant pointers, highlights to present to the wider group, which was something that was different in a way because, you having all of these ideas, we're about 6 or 7 on a table, and everybody's coming up with this, and we're able to agree as a group to present something meaningful to the wider group, which was accepted by everyone without any disagreement, without anybody feeling left out, or so yeah, that was something that stood out for me.
Okay. And in terms, so that, I mean, it's 3 weekends. It's 3 single days, or is it 2 days?
No, 2 days.
2 days. So that is quite a big time commitment. So um, as a businesswoman, I can appreciate that's taking time out of your life. In terms of thinking sort of future engagement with kind of local democracy, what did it leave you feeling that you wanted to do more of it, or that you've done enough for now? What did it leave you feeling that around actually doing this form of kind of decision making?
Okay, so I'm a person of the community. I do a lot of community work. I try to engage in anything that would community development, let me put it that way.
Hmm.
So that was why I was eager to even join the Citizens Assembly in the first place, because I've as a business owner, I've actually thought about, having meetings with our local businesses here at the city center. So yeah, so that was like an opportunity for me to speak on their behalf because we know where it pinches us, right?
Hmm.
However, um, this is something that I'm open to. Just give me a moment. I'm open to joining anything that has to do with the development of the city, of the city as a whole, of the city center, to encourage businesses as well. And because I see both sides, and I understand the importance of footfall, visibility, and access to, access for businesses. And also, as a resident, we want a clean, safe, and welcoming space that, if that that feels that makes us feel connected. Because I'm a mother of four. I've got, four children that I'm raising here. So yeah, we just want everything to. So yeah, I would be, or I'm not stopping there. Any opportunity that comes with the development of Dunfermline, count me in. Yeah.
Hmm. That's good to hear, and I do think you are the volunteer that's coming from the participants, but I think you as a local business person also makes it interesting to me, because I think sometimes in community engagement there can be an exclusion of business community as not part of the community. They're viewed as a separate thing, but invariably, particularly in small towns, the business owners are more likely to be living locally, so they have interests across a range of things around how you access and how you continue to deliver business within town centre. So I think your contribution to me did seem particularly interesting, bringing those two things that you've just reflected on. You'll be able to bring that to the table. Jonathan, on the back of that, can I ask a question around, did you look for local business owners in part of the sortition process?
So, well, I wouldn't say explicitly. It wasn't necessarily broken down to include business owners, as far as I'm aware. But the range of other kind of characteristics which had kind of shown on that slide were taken into
Yeah.
consideration. But clearly, it's good that we have, and that, we adjusted for making sure that there was a wide range of experience in the room. I think that's also what made it interesting for people. That people actually sat round in a table and they were learning from and listening to people from very different backgrounds with very different experiences of Dunfermline, of life in general. I think that's what made it interesting. So when Kemi brings her experience as a local business person, for example, that's going to be refreshing for someone to hear who's maybe not from that particular background, right? So one thing that I would say though about the sortition process, and again, this is something that is part of our kind of learning, is that you can adjust for many, many different things. Right, so I'll give you an example. There was a debate, in a sense, about, or at least a discussion, how do we deal with, I mean, do we include like voter intention, for example, in this? Because, does that make it party political? At the same time, if you don't, do you really get the kind of spread of opinion that's held in Dunfermline, right? So there are things that you can change about that process, but the absolutely fundamental principle is that you come up with something which is genuinely representative. So that's why we controlled for a whole host of variables to ensure that we ended up with what we feel is a kind of mini public, to use that term. I think it's a good term, by the way, because I think it kind of expresses what it felt like in the room as well. So yeah, lots to consider there. Just very lastly, on that as well, there's also considerations that you can make about size of the assembly as well. You could have an assembly.
You've read my mind. That was where I was about to ask you something on that.
Absolutely. I mean, you could have a bigger assembly. You could have it over more or less weekends. I would say no less than 3 weekends, to be fair, but you could have it over a longer scope of time. Of course, that's dependent on finance and funding. So we did receive funding from the Scottish Government, for example, which helped us to achieve this outcome, these processes. But again, there's different things that you look at there, but there are some essential principles that work across the board that we think work well as a model that's been produced from Dunfermline. And it was great to have that level of partnership. So community organisations and the general public, the Electoral Reform Society and the Council, funding from the Scottish Government. You can see how the various tiers here begin to link up. And that, in a sense, is what we want to achieve, not just through this one citizens' assembly, but as a kind of attitude to how we make decisions and to how decisions can be linked up, starting with communities. That's I don't know, one thing that we think could help to overcome some of the deeper problems that we face, the deeper democratic crisis that we face.
Right. Okay. And I did think it was interesting, Tammy, you talking about that very first session. It sounds like as a group, you were sense checking the topics that were chosen in the run up to it, which is a valid, natural response to that. Does anybody have, because, it feels like we can naturally kind of keep this conversation going, and I can bring other people, our other panelists into the discussion. Does anybody have any questions for Jonathan and Tammy immediately? Pauline, you have.
Thanks, Ewan. I don't know whether we're going to have a discussion together at the end, so I can wait till the end.
You can ask it just now if it's for.
Okay.
If it's for...
It is. So two things. I work for Historic Environment Scotland, and colleagues of mine look after the Abbey in the middle of Dunfermline. And we are also in Historic Environment Scotland. We have a draft strategy for how we look after our whole estate. So that's 300 odd properties across Scotland. And a key aim of that strategy is to improve community participation in decision making about our plans for our sites. Some of our sites can offer a lot for communities, and some are, much less opportunities. But a place like Dunfermline has tremendous opportunities for social, economic, environmental, cultural benefits. But everyone is very happy that we want to do more about this. But the question is, well, how are we going to do it? So you have this structure which is democratic, and I find it very interesting to hear about how that is formed. Secondly, sorry, I will try and keep this brief, but there is a project led by the council called the Heart of Dunfermline, which I hope you're aware of, to rejuvenate Dunfermline Abbey and its precinct for the benefit of the wider city. How do you see yourselves in that, given that what you've said is that the subjects that you want to grapple with and tackle are led by the community, and for the council in Hes, you would be an ideal structure to work with, and how would you see yourselves in a dialogue around the future of that site? Sorry for the long-winded question.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Thank you.
Jonathan, Temi, do you have a response to that? I mean, we can obviously we can come back to that question at the end, because obviously the other panelists might have comments on that as well.
Yeah, I think I'll just make one comment and then leave some of the detail to Craig and Lisa, who I think have very interesting things to say about this and about how we can take it forward. But I think it's worth just underlining that this whole issue of heritage, of history, of how important that is to Dunfermline, socially, culturally, and economically, came right through the assembly. It's one of the themes that really did kind of impress upon the participants and those who were observing the process as well. I think that was seen as something not only to be kind of proud of in a kind of retroactive way, but in a very proactive way, that people wanted to see lots of development around this. In terms of how the Assembly can engage with this in the future, I'll maybe leave some of that for Craig to talk about, who is going to talk about kind of, what we're going to do now and all the rest of it. But I just make this one point, that the kind of structures that were utilised in the Citizens' Assembly can be very useful, even in terms of bringing together meetings that aren't fully fledged Citizens' Assemblies. So there are facilitation techniques, there are outreach techniques, which can be shared, that aren't quite a full Citizens' Assembly, but which can be very helpful tools and resources. But in terms of the CA, in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the ongoing engagement and legacy, as I say, I'll maybe just leave that a little bit for Craig and others to talk about, because they'll have a lot of interesting things to say about that.
Okay, and we'll come back to we can come back to your question point at the end. I suppose I've got the Dunfermline 12 points, and I suppose that heritage is mentioned twice in it, because it's create a cleaner, greener, safer, more welcoming city centre with unique, distinctive identity, drawing on our history and cultural heritage, 97% support, and create a clear strategy to capitalise on its rich history and heritage, 97% prefer. So there's at least 2 points, just on my quick glance at it, that is kind of identifying that the heritage is something that people feel passionate about. Anna, you had your hand up.
Thank you.
Oh, so Anna, sorry, we've got a conflict here. We've got an Anna and an Anne. Anna Whelan, if you want to say
that's
first.
Me. Thank you. And apologies if I missed this in your presentation, Jonathan. Who's the driving force around a citizens' assembly? Like, I'm assuming it's not local government. If you can sort of elaborate on who drives it. So is it like a business improvement district where it's driven by local community, or was it your organization? And then my second question is, you mentioned, so gathering interest is sorry, I've forgotten the name of how you get the people involved, the selection process. What was it called? Yeah. Do you get people's interest first and then you put them into the pool, and then or is it something that is it garnered by other information elsewhere, like a jury selection, where if you're registered to vote, you're just automatically somebody that might get reached out to?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of driving the process, it was very much a kind of collective endeavour. It was one that was done in real partnership across a range of organisations. From an electoral reform society point of view, this is something that we had been kind of building up to over a period of years. So we had done a lot of different experiments with things that felt like citizens' assemblies but didn't have the teeth of citizens' assemblies, as kind of blueprints for how we might eventually run a citizens' assembly. And we needed to go to a place, engage with the council, engage with other potential partners to see if we could bring about a citizens' assembly in real time, in real life. And Dunfermline just fitted so many of these aspects. It had just achieved city status, so there was a kind of platform to have a discussion about it. When we had a meeting with the council, very receptive, enthusiastic. We created an operations group which involved the Electoral Reform Society. It involved the council, but it also involved folk like Lisa and other community organisations who were part of that kind of core group. So it was run very collectively. We had a fantastic lead facilitator, someone with a bit of experience in running these, a woman called Kelly, who had done fantastic work in the past. So we recruited her expertise. So we're very much working, as I say, on that kind of collegiate kind of basis. That is also, again, I think it's kind of prerequisite to a successful outcome.
Yeah.
Because if there are antagonisms between, say, the council and the citizens' assembly, or if ERS, for example, is seen as this kind of outsider group who's trying to impose a process on Dunfermline, then that's really difficult as well. So there are lots of complexities that we had to work through, and that's why we wanted to give an extended period of time, right? Time to generate respect, contacts, engagement, understanding. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was important in that. And then secondly, just on the sortition issue, yeah, it's kind of like a jury selection, right? There was something like about 9,000 letters went out across Dunfermline, and then that reduces down to those who respond to those letters.
Okay.
And then the responses to those letters get all the metrics associated with the demographics we want and so on. One thing that I will just say in closing, I can get the specific number, but from speaking to the folk at the Sortition Foundation, they did say that the response rate was very good. The ratio of people who responded in their experience of doing this was very good. So that again, I think was a positive signal about how people in Dunfermline felt about it.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Good question. And I had some of the other questions around about the genesis of it coming. I actually arose in Dunfermline, so that was really helpful. Anne.
Thanks, Ewan. Jonathan, I'm a community councillor for many years, and I'm just wondering how things went with regard to the community council, because your initial remarks about the feelings of an unableness to actually progress some of the community's desires and aspirations when I'm trying to overcome barriers. But also as a community councillor, I'm aware that that's a statutory organisation, and local democracy at the moment is very much an area of concern of mine. So I'd be appreciative if you could tell me if you had any work with community councils. Thanks.
Great question, Anne.
Yeah, really good question. So there are maybe two or three things that we just briefly outline. So there were two occasions in which we presented to a kind of summit of community councils in Dunfermline, which kind of meets semi-regularly. So we ensured that we presented at that, and we gave an impression of what the Citizens' Assembly was about, how it would function, opened ourselves up for questions and so on and so forth. And we also did a whole series of meetings with individual community councils and community councillors as well to get their views on the Citizens' Assembly and to think about how they could be involved and engaged in the process. Because I think local, I think these bodies do have a role to play when it comes to the lead up and aftermath of the Citizens' Assembly. So that's a kind of relationship that we want to cultivate. We also recognise as well that there can be tensions here as well. There can be this tension of saying, well, why do you need a Citizens' Assembly if we've already got community councils? And part of our answer to that is that we think we need something which is more structured in terms of how it can present a genuine cross-section of the public as a whole. Also, that the experience of community councils is very uneven across the country. So there's some very good, very active and very vibrant community councils. There are others not so much. So we see very much, again, that word partnership of these not being in competition, not being antagonistic to one another, but actually reinforcing one another, right? On reinforcing mutual growth when it comes to the strength of local democracy through the Citizens' Assembly, and that translating to stronger community councils and more engaged partnership across those institutions.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Thanks very much, Anna. It was a good question, and Jill Keegan was going to have a similar question. Jill and Nick, you've got questions in the sidebar, which I think we'll come to kind of at the end when we've heard from one of the speakers. But just given the time, I think we'll break maybe for a coffee because there's something natural coming about it. But I suppose on the back of that question about community councillors, I was also interested in how it engages with that. But for actual local politicians, what sort of response was there with elected members? I mean, I'm asking that because I've not read it yet, but there's a book that came out about Citizens Assembly earlier this year, and the title of it is Politics Without Politicians, which is not community councillors, but local elected representatives are local politicians. And even the title of that to me is kind of, is that will they hear that as a challenge to their position? And I know they don't think they're very powerful, but they're more powerful than some of us. And I wondered what sort of local response from local elected members there was to the assembly.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that I think Craig will have some interest in detail around, but the overall experience has been very positive thus far, and that local representatives, elected representatives, have been observers of the Citizens' Assembly. They have been supporters of it, and they're very engaged with looking at how the recommendations might be taken forward. Now, of course, that's not across the board, right? There have been obviously criticisms made as well, but from an ERS point of view, that's a really meaningful form of democratic tension, right? That, of course, there's not always going to be agreement, there's not always going to be buy-in, and that's okay, right? It doesn't need to be perfect because democracy isn't perfect, right? But it's much more impactful when there is that sense of legitimacy that comes from the Citizens' Assembly, which comes from the length of time and thought that goes into it, right? So, just to close by saying, if you can imagine that this is just part of our democratic culture, right? Just imagine that a local Citizens' Assembly is something which is part and parcel of how our democracy works right across Scotland. You can imagine the impact that would have on communities, on citizens going through those processes, and the impact it has on our politics in general. And I think it would be an extremely positive and exciting thing to see. So we're at the very start of that journey, but it's such a positive start. It allows us to go around and have meetings like this. It allows the participants that were involved in the assembly to feel positive about what they've done, and hopefully it's most importantly it's a model which shows that something really successful around this can happen, and that it should really be the start, not the end of that journey. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, Ewan, if that's.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And I think that your comment there about the tension as being a healthy thing, anybody who works in the communities, it's messy. And there's invariable disagreement. There'll be people that are not happy with outcomes, and compromise is required. And it's being able to sit with that rather than having some kind of platonic ideal of what a community is and how everyone agrees on absolutely everything is never going to happen. And that's more like a cult if that is what the outcome is. And the negotiation of kind of human behavior is kind of that one of there is inherent tension within it. And the example I give around how this plays out, I think all of us probably have tensions within our families. Our family constellations can be complicated. And that plays out at a community level and plays out at a political level as well. It's a very natural form of behaviour. Jonathan, thank you very much for that kind of overview. And obviously you've teed Craig up with lots of Craig's the best one to answer that question. So the anticipation is running high to hear from you, Craig. But it's 10 to 11 just now. So I think what might be best to do just now is we'll pause for 10 minutes for a comfort break and come back at 11 o'clock, and then we'll pick up with Lisa, Craig and John. But thank you very much both to Temi from her experience being on the panel, and hopefully Temi, you can stay on the call so that as we come to the end of the next session and the questions open up again, there might be more questions then that come. So it's nice to see it. And these are new emojis that I'm having float up my screen of hearts and clapping. It's very nice to see. I think they used to just stay at the bottom of the screen. So we'll pause for just now and come back at 11 o'clock to pick up with the rest of the team. Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. We'll carry on our session now with hearing from some more people who are involved in the kind of process of setting up the assembly and then facilitating the assembly itself. So for the next half hour or so, we're going to hear from John, Lisa, and Craig. And do I start with you, Craig, seeing as you've had such a lead in with you're going to have all the clever answers to various questions. And if you want to tell us a bit about your role within the council, we'll do Craig and Lisa, and then we'll come to John after that. But if Craig, do you want to give us your kind of role within the council and how your perspective on the setting up of the assembly?
Yep, thanks, Ewan. So my name is Craig Allen. I am the Community Development Team Manager in Dunfermline at Fife Council. I started this role probably about a year and 2 months ago. And when I first came into the role, obviously I was informed about discussions currently ongoing about the Citizens Assembly, and that it was sitting within our team sort of as a coordination role to carry that out. So obviously there was a bit of read up. I had never been involved in a Citizens Assembly before, with it being the first sort of local one within Scotland. But I did come from a background where I had been involved in the 1% mainstream participatory budgeting. So I had an awareness sort of that participatory process and how that can operate. And then when we got the funding from the Scottish Government in June, that was when all of the work just went absolutely mental for a long period. So obviously there was the establishment of the operations group, as Shafi's already spoke about, which Lisa was a key part of as a local resident. And yeah, I don't want to go over the sort of same ground as Shafi as to the exact process, but just touching on the point, because I can see one of the questions in the chat was around how the topics were selected, etc. So I don't know if it's useful to explore that.
Yeah.
Now, the way that generally happens, obviously we were sending out the 9,000 letters in Dunfermline to the random addresses. Now, in order to send that letter, we had to have a question, which is why the question was set quite broad and overarching, because there was a discussion within the operations group that ultimately, although this was technically a top-down process because it was commissioned by Fife Council, we wanted to figure out how we could flip that as quickly as possible. So sitting within that room, you had ourselves as council officers, several council officers, you had ERS, you had Kelly as independent consultant, and you had Lisa as well as another community rep as well, coordinating that. Now, the discussion very quickly revolved around the fact that actually the only people in the room that could say what issues were for the community were Lisa and our community rep, because they were the sort of representatives there on the resident side. Everyone else could look at it, they could consider the evidence that they know from on the ground from working within the area, but ultimately they aren't a resident of Dunfermline. And as we know, the sort of experts within communities are the community members themselves. So in order to flip that, that's when we established the different strands of community engagement. And what we done was 3 different strands. So it was a social media scrape, social media polling, and then in-person events that Shafi has spoke about. Once we had all those themes back, I would say it probably reached around 1,500 people in total across the 3 different methods. And we then presented the 10 top themes that came out to the Assembly at their very first session, which was a briefing night, civic reception. And what we done was we had a slight brief on each of the topics, and we went round the tables highlighting what had came out from the community consultation, community engagement, and sort of some of the background data that sat behind it. And then ultimately we asked the Citizens Assembly members to decide on what 2 topics they felt would be most relevant to discuss. And the Citizens Assembly members then voted on that, and that's how we then arrived at the 2 topics of city centre and local economy and community issues and local pride. So it was the Citizens Assembly that selected that based on the evidence from the community engagement work that was carried out over a period of time, which is why that question was left so high level, because June to October, even though it sounds like a long time, is not a long time, and it goes in a flash. So we were still carrying out that community engagement right up until the sort of week before, I think it was, or 2 weeks before the actual briefing night, to then carry that through, so that ultimately, even though the process was commissioned by Fife Council and could be viewed as a top-down process, the issues that were selected very much came from the community and then were selected by the Citizens Assembly themselves as that representative body in the room.
So and I have to say that's really helpful, that acknowledgement of it being a top, if you're going to do this sort of thing, somebody needs to organise it, and it tends to be somebody that's in a local authority or a government roles. So it's a really good acknowledgement of the kind of power dynamic there. So am I right in thinking, so you had 3 weekends, but before the 3 weekends, you had the briefing, that was the briefing night before that?
Yeah. So we had the briefing night in November, and part of that was obviously to give people an idea of what they'd be coming into. We know this could have been a really sort of anxiety-ridden thing for a lot of people, because especially when it's the sort of voices that sometimes aren't within all of these rooms, which is part of the process, ultimately that can make it then more nerve-wracking to walk into that room. So one of the points that we constantly focused on was that participant journey. How can we make this as easy as possible? Now, you're never going to take away all of the stress that it's going to cause, but you can definitely put in the small details matter. So the fact that the first time that they were meeting people wasn't at the weekend. They had already been in a room previously. They'd had the discussion. They'd went on to the civic reception, sort of heard from the buy-in from the elected members within the area. All of that was designed to ease. And then the members of staff that were contacting the participants, what we consistently tried to do was make sure it was the same person that was dealing with the same participants. Now, I wouldn't say we got 100% accuracy on that, because sickness and holidays happen. But it was a very concerted effort. And then the 2 individuals, members of staff, that were constantly in communication with the Citizens Assembly members were then the first people on the first weekend at the registration desk. So again, it was that familiar voice, it was that familiar person that then again, it would have worked for some people and some people wouldn't have made a difference. But ultimately the aim was to just reduce that stress and anxiety walking into a new environment from as much as we could.
And how many council staff would you say that the process has involved?
Oh, that's a hard question. I
imagine people from other local authorities are all thinking this is everyone's like, how much did this, I imagine the question would be, how much did this cost? And how much time did it take for actual staff to be delivering this?
Yeah, so I would say sort of across departments, because what we wanted to do was we didn't want to make it something that, as sort of a community development team, we were just doing. We wanted to look at how we embed this across as much as possible. So we had representatives there from sort of the governance side. We had sort of comms involved in it. So I would say probably, and I apologise if I get this wrong, I would say there's probably around between 10 and 15 officers involved at different points throughout the process. For some of the officers, so mainly from the officers within my team and probably comms, it was more intensive as a resource. It took up quite a significant bit of resource. But ultimately, when the process actually comes through and you see it delivered in the room, it does make it worth it. It is really powerful, it is really impactful, and it's one of those you get a chance to stand back and watch it and go, wow, this is community empowerment in action.
Okay, that's very positive to hear from somebody working within a local authority. Before we open up to questions, Lisa, first of all, do you want to introduce yourself and tell people not exactly, but who you are and what your role is within a particular part of the Dunfermline community?
Hi, so my name's Lisa Murray, and I am one of the founding members and continue with my friend to run a large community garden in a deprived area of Dunfermline called Tooth. So I run Tooth Community Garden. I was involved in the process really from the start, because our community group was one of the groups identified by the council as someone that ERS may want to chat with. As part of our work that we do we're part of a wider community group forum. So ERS spoke to all the different kind of community groups within that forum individually, and we decided that we would like to be involved with it from the start. I haven't obviously been to all the meetings, but I've attended a lot of the different workshops and things that ERS have put on throughout the kind of 2 years leading up to the Citizens Assembly. And then also became involved in the ops group as one of 2 community members, which was a fantastic experience for me.
And what would you describe your role within the ops group? How would you describe the 2 community reps' role? What was your role in that group?
Keeping it real, I guess keeping it any time that we felt that the conversation strayed too far from the community, I guess we brought it back. So, for example, just like a small example would be the payment for people taking part in the assembly. So the area that I work in is very deprived. There's a lot of people on universal credit, and there was an issue of, well, how do we pay so that, if someone's taking part that is on universal credit, how do we make sure that that then doesn't affect their benefits? And it was about, I guess my role was trying to kind of say, well, what would the community think of this? What's best for the community? And for me to make that call, another community representative, we are really engaged with our local community and the wider community, not only within our community that we work in, but the wider community work through different community groups, etc. And Citizens Assembly was a project that really, there was a lot of discussion around it locally, and what people thought about it. And previous speakers have mentioned that people were a bit cynical about it, and I would agree completely with that. And I guess for me personally, it was all about trying to work with the council and DRS to make sure that we got that participant journey right. And I would say that we worked, I eventually, as I said, ended up in the ops group, and I would say that both community representatives, council and DRS worked really well together. There was a lot of care and a lot of thought went into the Citizens Assembly from all of the organising parties. Craig's alluded to it as well, that it wasn't just the participants' journey and the kind of run-up, it wasn't just the process, it was about how they were catered for throughout the Citizens Assembly. And it was very much an ongoing process. And it's maybe part of the process that doesn't get a lot of attention. And I don't think it really gets the attention that is maybe needed, because, if people were, it turned out people were maybe deaf, or, they were struggling with anxiety or whatever, all these little things that people were struggling with reading and writing. And it was all these, or struggling with their computer literacy. So it was all these different things that the organisers were able to chat with participants and sort make that participant journey the best it could be. And I was there as an observer the 3 weekends, and I didn't have a role. And like Craig and John, and Tammy, I didn't have a role. I was there, I was at the observers table. And that gave me a really unique insight into how it all went, because I could observe over the 3 weekends, and it was really fascinating. It was really fascinating, and people worked so well together. The participants that took part in it, they worked so well together. They were keen to hear from the speakers, very engaged with what they were, what they were asked to do, really ably led by the facilitators. But the success of the Citizens' Assembly really comes down to the organisation and the engagement between all parties, including participants themselves, facilitators, council, community reps, ERS. And it was a fantastic experience. And I don't think that there was any one person out of those participants and the people that organised it that did not get something from it.
Right. So I suppose that's one of the questions. So one of the questions is legacy for Dunfermline, without even thinking about actually some of the recommendations that the Assembly made. What would you say that the legacy of the Assembly is? This is a question for both of you. Lisa, you're unmuted, so you can go first.
So I think the main legacy for me is that Assembly was not just the same old people with the same old conversations. You know, it was given a chance to people that would never be asked their opinion, that they would never offer their opinion because they wouldn't necessarily have the confidence. But the way that Certition organised that assembly, so it was completely representative. It was literally a mini public. It brought so many different voices to the table and gave those people confidence to participate and be involved in that decision making.
And Craig, sorry.
And I was just going to say, I think that as a group, that group will make sure that there is legacy, that the outcomes are acted on, and I think it's really important. It's important for our democracy.
Yes, because I think we've all been asked opinions and given opinions to things, and then thought, well, and now what next? And I suppose that is one of the questions that is for the council. But Craig, aside from the recommendations, what would you say? How would you describe the legacy of the Assembly?
So for me, legacy is two parts. We can look at it from an individual perspective for participants, and we can look at it as a whole from the Assembly. So if we're looking at it from an individual, we already have sort of a example of a participant who was recently not working and had lost a lot of confidence. And ultimately weren't really sure what they were stepping into through the next phase of their life and where they were going to be going. And through the Citizens' Assembly, and this is from the participant, I'm not just putting words in mouths, from the participant, they have identified that being part of the Citizens' Assembly provided them with a lot of confidence, built their confidence back up, and they have now applied to jobs using one of the services that they learned about through the Assembly, and then have now started employment. So there's an individual legacy there, which I know when we look at the bigger landscape and the bigger elements of participatory democracy and how we drive that forward and what that means, can sometimes get lost. But I think those individual legacies are just as important, because individuals always make up communities. Now, from a wider landscape and from the Citizens' Assembly as a whole, what I would be saying is we are now very much stepping into the next stages of what that legacy is going to be. So we're in the process of organising co-production workshops with partners from across the city. Now, those workshops, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking at these recommendations and asking the organisations around the city as to if they currently do something that works towards those recommendations, or if there's something that they consider being part of. Now, the reason we wanted to do that is, as part of the Assembly were asked who has ownership of this, who has ownership of this recommendation, who should be driving this forward. And consistently it came out that it was the council, it was other public bodies, but it was also the local third sector, it was also local businesses. So in order to look at that and establish something that is going to be acted upon in the manner that it was developed, these co-production workshops are crucial, because it's about getting everyone into the same room, looking at the recommendations together and saying, how do we work towards this as a city collectively? So not the council, not the third sector, but actually as a collective. And one of the things I would say in Dunfermline is we're extremely lucky that we have such a vibrant third sector within the city that spans a whole range of different interests, but is quite often good at coming together. So even though I can't say exactly what that legacy will be just now, because it's still in its formative stages, ultimately I would say the travel of direction currently looks extremely positive. And then one of the commitments that has been made to the Assembly is the fact that everyone will come back together in a year to look at the recommendations, look at what's been achieved, what hasn't been achieved, and then have discussion around that. Because as we know, and as you just mentioned, the feedback loop is quite often something that is not closed. And ultimately, this isn't something we want the Citizens' Assembly to be. We view it as something that was extremely powerful, but it's not good enough as a standalone. So if that product then goes and sits on a shelf, what's been the point? Because all people are going to feel is disappointment. Now, when we were discussing Citizens' Assembly, so we had a follow-up session as well after the Citizens' Assembly concluded, when we invited the members to come along and speak to the local elected members and senior officers within the council about the recommendations. So the way that it worked within the recommendations is that there was working groups that basically established around specific recommendations. It always went back to the full room for sort of that wider approval, which is where the 97% comes from, and for that wider discussion and challenge. But in order to focus in on something and in on the call to action, the recommendations around that, it was in that small working group. So when we then came to that night with the elected members and the senior officers, we were fortunate that I think 15 out of the Citizens' Assembly members were able to make it, and we had representation from each of those working groups. Right. So what we done again was we split everyone out, World Cafe idea, where the elected members and the senior officers worked around the different tables, and were able to really get into the detail of the conversation that had been happening at those tables and how these recommendations had came out, which again for me is important that that's understood, because the process of getting to that recommendation is just as important as the recommendation itself, and that's what makes it more powerful. So we wanted to make sure the Citizens' Assembly had that opportunity to sit down with the commissioners of this process and sort of explain what the recommendation was, why, and invite challenge. And I would say from on that night, it was a really positive environment and there was really engaged discussions going on. But as I said, the next challenge is now, let's go make it happen.
I mean, I think that's quite an interesting aspect that you brought in there, because I suppose the participants in this assembly doing a sense check on the topics that you're discussing, it's the equivalent of that the elected members are also, I suppose, understandably probably verifying that actually what is a bit behind. You've come up with some recommendations, but it's going a bit deeper than that, and so it ensures then that they will probably see it as a democratic process. Lisa, you were on the observers table. How many sort of, I think actually Jonathan mentioned that elected members were observers. How many sort of observers were there who were in a kind of neutral capacity?
There were a lot of different observers.
Mm.
A really varied range of observers. There were a number of elected members. I think there were certainly every
weekend.
assembly, and I think they were on every day actually.
Right.
Isn't that right, Craig? There'd be elected members there every session.
Right.
Not the same elected members, different
Yeah.
elected members. They were really engaged with the process. With their local MP as well came along. Head of the council came along. So it was there were high level people within the council and elected members, councillors, local councillors as well came along. But there was a much wider engagement as well, either from Scottish Government. There was a number of Scottish Government officials from different departments. People from overseas as well had come to see the process, because they were interested in the process. So it was a really wide variety of observers. Not just all Dunfermline observers.
Yeah. It was wider.
It was quite international, actually.
John, can I bring you in now as the facilitator, as one of the facilitators, not the facilitator, but one of the facilitators for the assembly? And so if you want to, John, similarly introduce yourself and explain how you got involved in it, and then maybe tell us a bit about the role of a facilitator.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thanks, Ewan. So first, a wee bit about myself. So I grew up in Dunfermline. So they have this sort of background and have seen Dunfermline through the past few decades. But as with many of my generation, the 80s, 90s sort of generation, when uni age comes along, you get up and leave. And I was one of those many people, and then I went overseas, and with COVID, I came back. So in many ways, I'm returning to Dunfermline almost as an expat with a young family. And so I've been working across the world for a wee while, more so in Asia Pacific for about 15 years in leadership development, change management, and this sort of thing. So facilitation is very much inherent in that sort of role. For me personally, I mean, this month I was over in China. Next month I'm going to Bangladesh. I fly around the world engaging in various different initiatives, but my home is now Dunfermline. I grew up in Dunfermline. I want to be part of Dunfermline. So last year I was having a look at, just in the autumn, what actually is around where I don't need to always get up and travel. And even, in terms of my actual job now in the UK, my office is in Aberdeen. So even just going to my office is 120 miles away, right? So what can I do that doesn't involve travel and can be part of this community? So I was having a look and I came across the City Assembly, and there was an opportunity to go for facilitation. I thought, well, that's kind of what I do. So I applied for that and got involved. Now, connecting with what Temi was saying earlier, it's quite interesting when you're thinking about initiatives. This initiative, Jonathan shared, they had dozens of rounds of community events. There was letters sent out to 9,000 households. Now, I can't remember roughly how much that is in Dunfermline, but that's what, 25-30% of households. There was Facebook, all of this sort of stuff. Well, I don't use Facebook. I didn't get a letter, and it wasn't part of one of these events. And it resonated with Tim and many other people. And it's quite interesting. So you think that's an incredible scale of announcements, but it still misses a lot of people. So for those who are on this call as well, it might be one of those things where within your own entity you're trying to reach out, but you always miss people, and I think that's quite interesting. So I was missed, but managed to apply and was great to be part of it. So yeah, sorry, that's an extended self-introduction.
Nope, that's a good introduction.
Came in for.
And so in terms of the role of a facilitator, what did that involve?
So facilitation, it's one of these sort of things where when you get multiple people together from different backgrounds, essentially what happens is you have diversity of voice. Now, with diversity of voice, that's fantastic in terms of getting lots of different opinions. But how do you then start to sort of synthesize voice and record and put and consolidate and put some of those thoughts down on paper? So this is one aspect of facilitation. Another aspect of facilitation is you're recognizing that you've got different personalities. As Lisa was saying as well, people with different needs, different confidence levels. A lot of people have great ideas, but are not necessarily natural orators and on putting that forward. So facilitation is also, it's like, right, acknowledging who's in the room, who has maybe not been communicating outwardly much in the past, however long it's been. How can we bring them back into this discussion and get that voice heard? So I would say those are the two vital points. It's enabling discussion, elevating the voice, but also synthesizing and recording those key points so that nothing gets lost. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, if we did a transcript today, it's probably going to be, I don't know, 50 pages or something. Imagine doing a transcript of 30 odd people getting together over 6 weekends, right? It's a multi-thousand page report. So you're trying to consolidate that into the summary that you put into our chat earlier, Ewan.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of, I suppose Lisa's reflected, I mean, everyone's reflected very positively on it, but as somebody who was a participant, you weren't just an observer, you were part of it. What was your kind of feeling about that kind of discussion that you were having, that you were helping facilitate within the room?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things, and I hope that people were getting the sense from listening to Craig and Jonathan and others. It's like that the organization behind this was genuinely really, really well done. Kelly, who was the lead facilitator, she was top class. She was fantastic. So we really owe a lot of appreciation to the team who enabled everything. For myself, I'm what's classified as a co-facilitator here. And what it means, it's not necessarily the person who's going up speaking, and it's really the enabler. So we're participating, observing, but it's not necessarily our voice, so to speak. If I can step back just for a minute, there was an experiment done in the early 1900s, right? And it was this guy, Sir Bolton or Sir Galton or something like that. And he got about 1,000 people together, and he asked random members of the public to guess the weight of an ox, right? And you had people with no idea about whatever. But once you aggregated across this wide population, they guessed the weight of an ox to less than 0.1% of an error. And when you're talking about deliberation, facilitation, community engagement, voice, Pauline's question earlier on, engaging with different stakeholder groups, that experiment is often highlighted. Once you aggregate across an included stakeholder voice, actually the risk of error, the representation, the risk of fault, all of these things, you start benefiting through that inclusion. And you heard from Temi as well. It's just like, if you're facilitating and you're getting to meet the Temis and the Lisas, these are the people that you want to elevate in your community. You want to enable these people in your community. So it's a joy to be part of that and get those voices into the discussions.
Okay, that's helpful insight into the role of the facilitator within the group. Going back to some of the questions that we got actually in the chat earlier, one of the questions from Nick, which I think we've answered a part of it around how the topics were selected. How were the experts selected who then shared information within the room on those topics?
Yep.
I don't know, Craig.
So within the operations group, obviously there was a wide spread of information, both sort of from ERS, from Fife Council. So there was elements that quite clearly linked to sort of Fife Council, internal operations, etc. And those officers were easy to identify from an internal perspective. But one of the things that we were really conscious throughout the process was that we never ever wanted to have it weighted in a specific direction. So we didn't want it to be all council officers, because then that's going to put a very, very council-centric lens onto it. Whereas we actually need the wider sort of views. So yes, you need the council officer, because there's an element of, you don't want recommendations to come across and be completely unrealistic and unachievable. So we want to make sure that what we're getting out of it is achievable, but you do also want to make sure that the thinking is much wider than sort of a public body officer. So we had a mix throughout of sort of council officers. We had academics in, we had third sector organisations from across Dunfermline in at different points. And I would say every process, you're always going to learn something. So the first weekend was a significant learning experience, because ultimately we had structured it in a way that there was quite a lot of presentation based activities. And even though we thought that we had factored in enough breaks, etc., to break it out, what it turned out, it was actually very, very intense for the participants. And there was actually a participant that didn't come back on the Sunday because they had felt overwhelmed and they weren't sure. Now, through sort of support and stuff, they were able to then come back for the second weekend, which is how we have 31 at the start, 31 at the end. But what we took from that was, even though we thought we'd structured this correctly, actually we haven't. So we now need to look at what works and how that's going to pull across into the second weekend, which, as you can imagine, with 3 weeks in between, does not really give you a lot of time to make. It doesn't give you a lot of time, but you can make a lot of adjustments. So we restructured it. It was a World Cafe type idea that worked really, really well, where participants could just float around the centre, because we'd taken over the full centre on the Sunday, and speak to the different organisations from around Dunfermline. And that worked really, really well, because it was moving at their own pace. They were able to have as long a conversation or as short a conversation, depending on their interest in it. And they took a lot of value from that. So what we started to do was integrate that more into the design of the second session, and also just small details. Like, instead of having one presenter at the front of the room where people are engaged in that one conversation for that sort of 10-15 minute period, we had points where we had two different academics. So you had one in a lounge space and one in a studio space. And then after that presentation time, there was then time to switch. So it was just the small adjustments on people being able to switch off and adjust to then go into a different environment, reset, sit back down and engage in a different discussion. And from the feedback from participants, it was really, really positive. We were also conscious of, obviously, different elements such as gender balance, which can sometimes bring different perspectives and different views in. So we looked at the contributors across a full weekend, and we tried to make sure that if you had 3 council officers presenting at some point, there was also 3 people presenting from different aspects, and then you had the wider scope of the actual experience of the city. Because ultimately, that's, I'm always going to go back to it and I'll always say it, that is the experts within that city. So even though we have academics who are experts in subjects, they're not experts in Dunfermline.
Yeah.
Whereas the local organisations are experts in that city, because they live and breathe it every single day and see the challenges, see the opportunities. So we just always try to make sure that there was balance going across a full weekend, and it wasn't heavy in either way.
Yeah.
And there was always different perspectives being brought into it. And one of the other things we did try to do, which had mixed success, I would say, was ensure that there was panels. So there was opportunities for the questions to be asked direct to presenters. So it wasn't just a case of stand up, present your idea, and that was it. But actually, it was a case of, you're going to present, then at some point, whether it's directly after or whether it's moving towards a panel, you will be asked and participants can quiz or follow up on things that you've highlighted. And that, as I said, it had mixed success, and I think it had mixed value for different participants. But again, with a group of 31 people, you're always going to have elements that work for some and don't work for others.
So these are, and it's about, you're highlighting what Lisa, obviously you said that the preparation and the care is kind of definitely coming across really loud and clear from everyone involved in this. We've got two questions that have just come in from Julie, and I'm going to jump to one for Jonathan, because I know Jonathan might have to leave early because he's got a meeting. Jonathan, big question. How will this be rolled out across other local authority areas?
Well, that is a big question, but that is, in the end, our ambition. So this is a process. We've created hopefully a positive model in Dunfermline. As Craig outlined, it's the first local citizens assembly in the country that's ever happened. But in order for it not to be the last, we are going to need to build political will. We're going to need to generate excitement and enthusiasm around the idea through a whole programme of outreach, which we're planning. And by the way, meetings like this are part of that. So thanks again to SURF for the invite to us all to present to you. And in the end, it's about building a partnership between local government, national government, and communities. But I want to maybe conclude by saying that the cost involved in making a better democracy is very low in comparison to the outcomes that you will achieve. It costs very little to roll this out and institutionalize it across the country. But what it can do in terms of community cohesion, in terms of rebuilding democratic cultures, in terms of giving people some decision-making power back in their lives, which we know will remedy all sorts of social ills, is almost something that you can't quantify. So if we can get to that point, then we're going to be in a healthier place, not just locally, but nationally when it comes to our democracy and our society. So that's the case we've got to make. I suppose we've been making the case for a long time, but now that we've got a model, now that we've got an example, it reinforces and underlines the reality that the case entails. It shows that it's possible. And that's always important when you're trying to campaign for change, that you show that, yes, this is possible. We've done it. It's had a positive impact, and now it needs to happen across the country. We're under no illusions this will be a long campaign. It'll be a long argument that needs to be made, but we are convinced and confident that in the end, we can bring about a successful conclusion when it comes to rolling it out, and it'll need the help of everyone on this call, and everyone that's invested in this type of democratic innovation.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And I should probably say that, sir, we have a student joining us next week, a master's student from Edinburgh University, who's doing some work around community councils and kind of looking at mapping them around the correlation between community councils, or the absence of community councils, and deprivation. But as a secondary part of the work, we're also going to be we're trying to get to talk, we're wanting to talk to the outgoing parliamentarians around their interest or non-interest in local democracy. And why it's maybe not moved as fast as there seems to be an appetite for it among some quarters within the Scottish population, but within the Parliament it isn't something that has moved at pace. And so we're doing a little bit of research around that, around what national politicians take on this. So that's something that we hope that we'll have something to sort of comment on later in the year. Can I, with the rest of the panel, can I go back to one of the, before I take your second question, Julie, your first question, Julie, the earlier questions around community councils and the interaction, because, well, Lisa and John, I know you live in Dunfermline, and Craig, you obviously work there and undoubtedly work with community councils in your role within the council. What was your kind of take on the interaction between community councils and the assembly? Lisa, you first.
Well, I know I'm involved in the local community council anyway, so I know that our chair of our local community council was also a facilitator he also was really quite closely involved with the Citizens Assembly project. So that was fed back to our local residents anyway, of Tooke and neighbouring Garvick. I think personally community councils they're a great thing. It does tend to be a certain type of person that goes to them. I know across Dunfermline not all areas are represented by community councils, which is an issue. And I think that's maybe what Jonathan was trying to get at, where they complement each other. It shouldn't be against each other. It should be a complementary thing, because there's definitely a place for both. And for me, they fulfil, although they can be termed local democracy, they fulfil different roles.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, we would agree that, I think community councils are a really good, important thing, but there are other ways there are issues around it that need addressed, but also they sound like it augments the democratic process. It's not trying to displace something, but it is augmenting something. Craig, from your perspective within the local authority.
Yeah, so obviously Jonathan highlighted that we made a concerted effort to speak to community councils about this process, including going to individuals and also as part of a collective when they all came together. Now, naturally, there's scepticism from some elements. Overall, from that wider presentation that was done to community councils as a collective, I would say I didn't feel significant amount of tensions in the room. There were some questions that were presented and some concerns that were highlighted, but none that weren't valid and weren't worth a conversation. And I think for me, it's the same as everything. If you go in and you do something without conversation, you create that tension because you're doing something to someone without having a discussion about it. So when we look at fundamentals of community engagement, if we approach this in the same way and actually highlight how these things can be complementary, take the challenge and have the conversation and find the resolution, then ultimately they can be complementary. Now, I'm not going to say that you're going to win over every single person. Again, that's back to that point. That's probably impossible. But ultimately, as long as the process is done in a pure way, where all stakeholders are involved at the earliest possible point, for me, that is always going to minimise any tension that may exist. So I think it's quite often down to the process rather than the actual two structures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think there are issues around between local authorities or public services or public agencies and their engagement. Sometimes you will initially hear hostility to things, and that can, as an individual, that can be quite difficult to kind of manage personally, which is why I think being trained in if you're trained in facilitation, you get a big advantage about how you kind of neutralize it kind of psychologically, because communities have valid reasons to feel grumpy about certain things, but it's making sure that that grumpiness isn't sort of internalized by the people who are hearing it, but kind of engaging with that in a positive way. John, you were about to say something in response to the question.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the things which is really interesting. There wasn't any of the gripe, right? People came with a very positive thing. So I think that's maybe very refreshing for people who work in, as councillors and others. We've already heard, we had a councillor on a facilitation team, we had councillors as speakers, we had definitely councillors as sort of observers. But I guess a couple of points. One is, you can have people who are great at their job, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're great communicators at an event, right? So this is something to bear in mind when organising these sort of things. Who's also speaking, and is training required to get them comfortable with communicating in a public forum? But then I think I want to highlight today, in a simple way, community. If you're in the community, it's great. If you're out of the community, you know that you're out of the community. And the same is true with structures and processes, right? And one of the key words, I think, during the first 2 weekends was awareness. there was a very broad lack of awareness of structures and systems and different services at play. And I think that this is something which is really, really important for councillors and others to be aware of, that yes, there's tremendous things happening, but your average person isn't necessarily aware. So having this be complementary, I think, is very beneficial, because it becomes another platform for communicating and building awareness of what's already going on.
Okay, really helpful, interesting insight there. One of the other questions that Julie had was for you, Craig, about how does it fit with community planning, and will it form the new local community plan?
Yeah, so it's definitely part of the discussions, because ultimately the way this has been viewed as a community mandate, which naturally then coalesces with the community plan. So there's definitely discussions about how that can work and how that can translate. It's just not reached a conclusion yet.
Right. Okay. So obviously I've been leading this discussion and asking questions, but does anyone else, we had some questions in the chat, but does anyone else have any questions for our three sort of second half of the morning speakers? Anne.
Thanks, Ewan. I just wanted, not a question, but I want to make a comment. I think it was so important that there was a remuneration given to the participants, and also what Lisa was saying, that you are aware that that might cause problems for people that were on universal credit. That is something that is so often missed out on community engagement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And it's a really good point, and it's one of, we get quite a lot of engagement through university research, and it's it's one of the increasing points that we bring back to them. It's like they want to come and talk to community groups, but it's like, well, you're getting paid to do it. I know you're going to offer sandwiches, but you're paying these. This is people's time, and how you actually remunerate them is fairly crucial. Any other comments or questions for Augustine? Augustine's got a question, and then I'll come to you, Lisa.
I'm mute. Yeah, hi. Sorry, everyone. I mean, I'm sure that Jonathan would have been able to comment on this also, but it'd be interesting to hear from, I think, Craig and maybe Temi as well, in terms of the discussions and how that's then looked at in terms of a legacy point of view. Because I suppose it having been done in Dunfermline makes it perhaps easy to say, well, what are other places that are maybe like Dunfermline where we could also explore doing this? But I suppose if you think about the rest of Scotland, like bigger cities or rural areas, I'm quite interested in how this model can flex, or where there's issues, or if there's perhaps areas where things became very local or hyper local and became relevant to a specific area, or they became much bigger and citywide, and people felt like their community experience wasn't really reflected in that, and how that tension is maybe reflected, if there's lessons to be learned from that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, because for me, one of the things that made Dunfermline so powerful was the fact that it was such a defined area, with a relatively small population. Do you know what I mean? Of around 50 to 55,000. So obviously one of the main points that we consistently pushed was that sort of awareness raising through multiple channels. And as John's already highlighted, within an area of 55,000, there were still people missed within that, even though there was extremely concerted efforts to raise as high an awareness as possible about it. So I think for me, the tension comes about when you bring it up into larger areas, or even on national areas, because obviously we've seen that Scotland has had national citizens' assemblies, how you can get that same engagement, get that same model, which, because it is ultra local within Dunfermline, I think the answer is probably you can achieve the same level. Now, it's not to say it doesn't carry weight, it doesn't hold value, and it still has a purpose. But I think it's just about acknowledging that if you try to take an ultra local level process and apply that into a national arena, or even a sort of a city arena, it is going to naturally impact on how that process is delivered and how that process is engaged with. So I don't really have the answer, unfortunately, other than when you're stepping into the design of the process, acknowledging what situation you're in and how that is going to impact on it, because that's going to affect your design and implementation of it. And if it's done well and taken into account well, then there's no reason that it can't continue on and be as successful in a slightly different format. But if you don't acknowledge that, and if you try to do a lift and shift of the model, then that's when you're then going to start to run into challenges for me.
Which comes back to the sort of the couple of years prep that's kind of results in this, that there's got a lot of background preparation. And I suppose citizen assembly as a concept, some of the ones that are the well-known ones have been around social related issues that are national, the abortion debate in Ireland. So it's a sort of a theme that's being explored rather than a place. And the Dunfermline, to me, is an interesting one because it's focusing very much on a place. Augustine and I were both involved last week at a workshop or a day of workshops around the Pride in Place money coming from the UK government, which again is sort of interesting because it's neighbourhoods, it's sometimes not natural geographic neighbourhoods, they might be adjacent to each other, and there are issues around decision making at that process. They're maybe not appropriate for citizens' assemblies, but there's issues around governance there are sort of commonalities here. Lisa, you had unmuted to, I don't know if you had a question or just a comment that you wanted to.
It was just a kind of like final comment. I think for the people that have not been involved in this process, that have listened to our presentation today, I think one of the main reasons behind the success of this has been the way, like, our communication. Initially, we've already spoken about that initial weekend where, there were a lot of presentations and it was too much for something. A lot of those people, they were quite senior council leaders that were speaking, quite senior council officers that were speaking with quite complex graphs, maps, etc. Now, any one of us on this call would be able to access that, absolutely no problem. But where a lot of councils and public bodies' communication falls down is that they put it out at a level that they are acceptable. It's acceptable for them, but they forget that the vast majority, the average reading age is 9 or something in Scotland. And people can't read these maps. People can't read this data. All this data that councils, etc., and public bodies, Scottish Government are turning out, people can't read it. We've talked at length about reaching all sectors of society and things, but in the way that councils and public bodies, governments communicate, they're failing at the first hurdle. So we were very mindful when we designed this process that it would be for everyone. And I think that was a really big input that myself and the other community representative had. And I guess that's what I kind of meant by keeping it real. Got to keep it in anything like this. Any one person that wants to do something like this has to keep it, has to meet the community where they're coming from. The communication has to be at the heart of everything, and it has to be done. It has to be done right. And as Craig mentioned, when we realised that first weekend that it was too much, the communications were changed. And the same with the design. The design process reflected different learning opportunities for people, so that people could access the information in a way that benefited them. That was all.
It's a really good point, but I think that point around suggests that people don't necessarily know their audience if they're pitching it at a level, but it's about convenience often for some forms of engagement. It's about convenience for the person that's asking the questions about how they do something, and actually it's less convenient and slower, and in the short term more expensive to do it in a different way, but the benefits are obviously outweigh it. Craig, you had a point to make.
Yeah, so it's slightly off topic, so I apologise, but it's just so I don't forget. So there was independent evaluation being done on this process by the London School of Economics. So I believe the report is in draft format just now, but I would imagine that it would be published in due course. And obviously that is about the credibility, because obviously we were all involved in this process. So sometimes that can affect your ability to take a step back and view it as critically as maybe you should. Now, obviously, we're all reflective practitioners. We all like to view that we critique everything and continue to challenge and change, but you're always going to have blind spots when you're in a process for so long. So the independent evaluation was obviously there to give it that sort of independent validity rather than everyone that was involved in depth within it.
Okay, thanks. We'll look out for that. But I mean, I do think that both Temi's response and Lisa's response, although sort of involved, you know, they've been frank about what it's been like, and it's been frankly positive. And I know one of the questions is the final questions around is electoral timescales. We maybe don't have time to go into that, but it's in this current election, I have to say I feel quite depressed by democracy. However, this morning makes me feel more positive about it, because there has been a very good, constructive and positive experience for all of you participating in it, which is really, really excellent to hear. Obviously, the recommendations of the Assembly and your processes beyond that are of high interest, but also the fact that you've already started arranging workshops around them and around joint delivery of those kind of objectives is also kind of heartening to hear around a place doing that. So thank you very much to Temi, to Lisa, to John, to Craig, and to Jonathan for your participation this morning. It's been a really excellent morning discussion, and so I think and even that's probably only a brief insight into what the Citizens Assembly do. We're about to close. SURF have a series of workshops over May. There's over 4 workshops coming up, which are not online. They're in real places. There's 1 in Edinburgh and 3 in Glasgow. Emma will be sending comms after this to you all. If you want to book in for any of them, we'd love to see you. And hopefully the work that SURF, along with other organisations like Scottish Community Alliance, are doing around local democracy for the next Parliament is something that we will gradually see some improvement on. But obviously what we've heard this morning from our speakers in Dunfermline, that there's a really positive model that we've seen piloted there, and hopefully we'll see more of that. And I hope everyone enjoys the good weather for the next 2 days and then rain at the weekend.